Okay, so I would like to discuss this exercise that you were supposed to do. I'm going to discuss this in quite a bit of detail. So for those of you who haven't had many problems with this exercise, this might be a little too much perhaps. So if you feel that that's too detailed and too basic, then I suppose you could just skip certain parts or just move to the parts where you did have problems. But hopefully most of this information will be of some use, and especially for those students who have struggled with this exercise, who have had many errors, and who in general have problems with articles. This should be a lot more useful. Of course, this is not this will not replace regular practice and studying on your own, especially if you actually need that practice. If you have problems with article use in English. But hopefully this feedback, which is just my discussion of the exercise, which I would have done anyway in class, right? So this is instead of a class presentation. So let's talk about it. Okay. So there was a knock on the door, right? A knock on the door, right? This doesn't always work. Well, I hope this is not going to cause problems as I go along. So there was a knock on the door. Obviously a knock, right? There was something happened. A knock. I heard a knock, right? So I hope this doesn't need explaining. On the door, right? On the door. We always use the definite article when we talk about parts of certain objects or even people, which are sort of the obvious part of that object or person, right? So we can say, for example, I saw a person who fell on the pavement and hit the head against it, or this car, or there is a car outside and all the doors are open, right? So obviously the assumption is that, of course, a car always has doors, right? So the doors, right? The doors of that car, even if we mention the car for the first time. And here, obviously, if we are talking about a house or a flat or a room, it's obvious that it's got a door. So the door of that room, that house, and so on. So this is basic stuff, but just in case. So I opened it and I found a small a small dark man in a blue overcoat and a woolen cap, right? So a small dark man in a blue overcoat and a woolen cap, right? So yes, so that's what I saw, right? Some man, a man, right? Clearly I saw him for the first time, and he had, what did he have? What was he wearing? He was wearing an overcoat, a blue overcoat, and a cap, a woolen cap. So it's all mentioned for the first time. There's nothing specific about these objects. We know nothing about them from any previous context. Okay, so to continue, he said he was an employee. Yes, so it's going to be a little bit of a struggle of the gas company and had come to read the meter, right? So why is that? He was an employee of the company, right? An employee because obviously there are more employees. He was one of them. The gas company because we assume that there's just one in the area, right? So he's referring to that specific company. And that's what he would himself would say, right? I'm an employee of the gas company. Of course, if there were more gas companies and he was, for example, advertising an offer saying, I'm an employee of a gas company, of a new gas company, and I would like to convince you that you should use our services. But otherwise, you just use the company that's available, right? Or that works in the area. Okay, and had come to read the meter, right? So an employee of any gas company comes to read the meter, the gas meter, right? So you've got one probably in most cases, right? And if you had two, he would come to read the meters, right? Because they're the specific meters in your home. Okay, but I had a suspicion. That he wasn't speaking the truth, because meter readers usually wear peaked caps, right? So I had a suspicion. So it's almost like saying I have an idea, I have a feeling, and so on, right? So a certain suspicion, right? Or some suspicion that he wasn't speaking the truth, right? So with truth, we normally use the, assuming that there's one truth in each situation, in a given situation, right? But we would say he was speaking a lie, right? Because there are many possible lies, whereas there is one truth in any given situation, of course. But you can just remember that that's what we normally say, right? The truth. Is that the truth? What's the truth of the situation, right? So we hardly ever use a with truth. Because meter readers. So here we have a generic or general noun which refers to a certain group or type of people, right? So meter readers in general, right? Meter readers in general usually wear peaked caps, also in general, right? Not any specific peaked caps. In the singular, of course, we could put that in the singular. We could express the same in the singular by saying a meter reader usually wears a peaked cap, right? So any meter reader wears a peaked cap usually, right? Okay, so let's continue. However, I took him to the meter, right? So that's the specific meter that I've got in my house or flat, right? Which is in a dark corner under the stairs. So meters, I don't know why it's doing this. So meters are usually in dark corners, under. So here it's I would say under the stairs, and I think the key, that's what the key says, I'm not sure, but the assumption is that, well, let me just move from the beginning. So I took him to the meter, obviously my meter in my house, which is in a dark corner, right? Because there are possibly many dark corners in my home, or even under the stairs. Right, under the stairs, because again the assumption is that there is one flight of stairs, one set of stairs. So that's the part of the house, the stairs, right? Just as it has a bathroom. So we would say he went to the bathroom, he went to the kitchen, he looked under the stairs, right? And here in the brackets we have a generalization, right? So meters in general are usually in dark corners in general, some all possible dark corners. Under so here the problem is that, or the question is, are we talking about that specific part of the house? So it's like, do we mean that most houses, for example, have stairs, and so they have that one flight of stairs, and yeah, so it's just like saying, you know, in the bathroom, most houses have gas heater in the bathroom, right? Because it's that one bathroom in the house. So you could think of the same here, right? Under the stairs, there is this area where the stairs are, and that's where the meters are, and that's actually what I would say, right? But you could think of this as, you know, in general, under stairs, under some stairs. So I wouldn't treat this as an error. This just sounds more natural to me. Okay, so let's continue. I asked if you had a torch, right? So do you have a torch? Obviously, right? Not a specific torch, any torch. He said he disliked torches and always read. You know, this is of course pronounced red because it's the past, right? He said he disliked and always read meters by, so I would say read meters, although actually the meters I think would possibly be also acceptable. Meters in general, unless you mean, oh, something went wrong. I hope this is not broken now. He read meters in general by the light of by the light of a match, right? So that's what we say, by the light of something, in the light of something, of a match, some unspecified match, one of the matches in a matchbox, right? Okay, so I remarked that if there was a leak, this is causing more problems than I thought it would. So there was a leak in. So this one is slightly controversial. I would say the gas pipe, because we're assuming there's one, unless you, because basically there's one pipe that carries the gas, right? There's another one that carries the exhausts, right? But I suppose the one that may cause an explosion would be the one that actually carries the gas. So I would say in the gas pipe. But if you said in a gas pipe, you know, we don't know what the hookup is in a given person's house or flat. So maybe there are more gas pipes. So it's not so clear. But I think the gas pipe is like the more likely possibility. There might be an explosion, right? Obviously, something might happen, an accident, an explosion, something that we haven't yet specified. So an explosion while he was reading the meter, right? So that meter that he came to read, basically, the meter in our home. Okay. He said, as a matter of fact, and you can treat this as a fixed expression, like saying actually. As a matter of fact, that's what we say. There was an explosion in the right. So there was an explosion in the last house I visited. So there was an explosion. I hope that's obvious, right? We're mentioning some event for the first time. There was an accident. There was an explosion in the last house, obviously, right? Because if we say last, we are specifying or limiting the possibilities, right? So we always say the last, the first, the next. So in the last house I visited. And Mr. Smith, the owner of the house, right? So obviously there's usually only one owner. So he's the owner of the house. So that house that we've already specified, that we've mentioned. So the owner of the house was burnt in the face, right? Because he's only got one face. We can't say a face because we could say that if you had a few faces, right? Like 2 or 3. But normally people have one face. So obviously we say in the face, in the head, right? But you could say on a leg or a hand or an arm because we've got 2 normally, right? And then it would largely depend on the context whether we say the hand or a hand. But the face, Mr. Smith was holding a lighted match, right? So one of many possible matches at the time of the explosion, right? At the time, right? So this is the specified time, the time of the explosion that has been mentioned, right? Earlier we said there was an explosion. Now we're referring to that explosion in the next sentence. Okay, to prevent a possible repetition of this accident, right? To prevent a repetition of something, right? So there are many possible repetitions of this accident. I lent him a torch, right? So just a torch, because I had a torch. This hasn't been mentioned. Right. So we don't know if it was any specific torches and if he or she has got any more torches, how many he's got, and so on. So just a torch. He switched on. Now obviously you know that it's got to be the torch, right? Read the meter. Obviously, I hope it's obvious why. By now, right? And wrote the reading, right? The reading. So what he read, right? In Polish, odczyt, right? So and wrote the reading. down on the back of an envelope, right? Well, sorry about that. So an envelope. Okay, so right, down on the back of an envelope, right? So the envelope is not specified, or it's not any specific envelope, but the back, right? Because there's just one back of an envelope. In general, in phrases with of, the first noun or noun phrase would be preceded by the, right? The development of a country, or the country, depending on the context, but always the development. The future of a person, or the past of a person, although normally we would say a person's past. Okay, so he said in surprise, right? So with those phrases with in plus certain emotion or state of mind, we don't use any articles, right? So in surprise, in shock, in fear, and so on, in astonishment. So no article here, assuming I can actually type it in. Okay, he said in surprise that meter readers in general, right, meter readers usually put, and here again it's not, I would say put the readings, but if you said put readings down, that wouldn't be a problem, I think. So put the readings, so put what they've read from the meter. So in that sense it's specific, but you could just as well say put readings, I guess, down in a book, right? So there is a book where they put the readings. He said that he had, right, past perfect, that he'd had a book. So he had a book earlier, right? So he said he had a book, but that it had been burnt in a fire. I'm sorry, in the fire, right? Because we know which fire he's referring to. That was talked about earlier, right? Because this is basically one text divided into individual sentences. Bird in the fire in Mr. Smith's house. So before names like surnames, titles, normally we don't put any articles except in some specific situations. By this time I had come to the conclusion, right? So you can come to a conclusion or the conclusion depending on the context. So the conclusion, if the conclusion is specified, and here it is specified because it's kind of explained or described. What conclusion? He came to the conclusion that he wasn't a genuine meter reader, right? So he came to the conclusion that he wasn't a genuine meter reader. And the moment he left, right, the moment something happened, that's what we say, because this is, the moment is specified, right? Which moment? The moment he left, right? He left the house, this specific house. I rang the police. And you just have to remember, right, that we say the police, just as we say the government. So some types of nouns just use the article as a rule. Are John and Mary cousins, right? So is it the type of relationship that they have, or the type of relationship between them? I don't know what's going on here. It's very bizarre behavior. Okay, so are they cousins? No. So I'm just going to copy this. Okay, so that's causing more problems than I expected. Right, so are they cousins? No, they aren't cousins, they are brother and sister. Right, so again, no articles. Because it's different from saying I've got a brother or I've got a sister. They are brother and sister, so it's like saying they are siblings. So rodzeństwem, right? So in that case, we don't use you don't use an article. It's like an expression. They are brother and sister. Just as you would say they are husband and wife. You are now husband and wife, right? Not a husband and a wife, because that would sound really strange. But obviously, she's got a husband, he's got a wife. Okay, so the fog was so thick that we couldn't see the side of the road. Right, so the fog was so thick. So the assumption is that we know that there was fog, right? It must have been mentioned earlier, or it's obvious from the context, because otherwise we would first have to explain, well, there was fog, there was a fog, a heavy or dense fog. But in general, we say the fog or the snow, the rain was so heavy, and so on, that we couldn't see the side of the road. So of the road that we were driving on, and of course it has two sides, but obviously we are concerned with one side, right? The side where we could go off the road, basically. So it wouldn't make sense to say that we couldn't see a side of the road, because it doesn't really matter that much if we can see the other side. We are obviously, what we mean is just the side of the road that we are focused on while driving. Otherwise, we would say we couldn't see the other side of the road, right? We followed the car in front of us. So again, the car hasn't been mentioned or hadn't been mentioned, but it's specified in the sense that we say in front of us, right? So there was obviously, you could say there was a car in front of us, but if you just say we followed, if you said we followed a car in front of us, that would sound a little strange, because it would suggest that there were more possible cars in front of us to follow. But that's not usually the case. There's just one car, right, that you can follow. That's the one in front of you, right? So that's why we say follow the car in front of us, and hope that we were going the right way. So yeah, there's only one right way, so the right way. Okay, I can't remember the exact date of the storm. The exact date, because there's only one exact date of this storm. So obviously in this case we are referring to some specific storm that the other person or the other people know about. So the exact date of the storm. But I know it was a Sunday, right? And that's something that probably some of you are not comfortable with. But here, obviously, we mean that it was just one of those Sundays. It was a day, like it's like saying it was on a rainy day, right? It was a Sunday, right? So it's different from saying like it's Sunday today, right? Or the exam took place on Monday, right? Because then we are referring to we are just specifying a specific date, right? So if we say we had an exam on Monday, that means probably last Monday, right? So that's what we normally say, right? But here what we mean is that it was just one of the Sundays, basically. One of many possible Sundays. It was just a Sunday. Because everybody was at church. Right, so this is a specific context, because in most cases, of course, we don't use an article before days of the week. But if we mean it was an unspecified Sunday out of many Sundays, it's a bit hard to explain, so I'm struggling a little bit, but I hope it makes sense. So I was at church, right? So if you remember the difference between phrases like to be in prison or to go to prison and to go to the prison or to be in the prison or to be in church, or you can say also at church, or to be in the church or in the school versus at school. So what's the difference? At school, in church or at church, in prison, in hospital. So in these expressions, we are talking about being at that place or in that situation for the purpose for which that place was created, right? So if you say, I was in church, it means I was attending a service or a mass, or I was praying, right? If you say I was in prison, or he was in prison, or he is in prison, that means that he's been sentenced, right? He committed a crime. If I say she's in hospital, it means she's ill or sick or has had an accident, right? But if we say that we go somewhere, for example, if we go to the hospital, I can go to the hospital to visit a sick friend, right? So I don't go to hospital because I'm not being hospitalized. I'm just going to visit somebody. You could say I went to the church to look at the notice board, or I went to the church to take some photos maybe, or something like that, right? Or I went to the prison to meet my friend there, right? Or something like that. Okay, so to continue, on Monday, so you could say on Monday, because from the context it's already obvious that it's the Monday after the Sunday. That's why you can also say on the Monday. You don't have to, but because if you say on Monday, it will be obvious here, right? It's just like we have already kind of set the context, right? So we can say just on Monday as we normally do, or especially in storytelling, you could say on the Monday, right? The Monday after that Sunday that we've mentioned, right? So it's up to you basically. Although I would say that this kind of gives this is kind of more likely in this context. On the Monday, still I probably should put it in brackets if I can. No, I can't. I prefer not to experiment with this application because it's causing some problems. Okay, so on the Monday, the post didn't come, right? So normally you say the post, or in American English, the mail, right? So that means all the letters, parcels, packages, etc., right? The post didn't come because so you could potentially skip the article here, but that's not likely because what we mean is the roads in the area, right? Because we don't know if all the roads were blocked. So the roads that we're interested in, the roads in the area, were blocked by fallen trees, some fallen trees, right? So this is not specific enough. Okay, so here we are basically introducing the subject of trees, of fallen trees, but so we're saying there were some fallen trees. That's why the roads were blocked. But of course the roads are kind of assumed that they exist, right? Peter thinks that this is quite a cheap restaurant. So quite, obviously after quite we use an article assuming that we have a countable noun, right? In the singular, obviously, right? So countable nouns in the singular normally need an article. And after quite we use a in such a situation. There's been a murder here. There's been a murder here, right? So we mention a murder for the first time. Where's the body, right? So obviously if we mention murder, a murder, then of course if there has been a murder there has to be a body, right? So we're asking about that body of the dead person, of the murdered person. So where's the body? There isn't a body, right? So of course here we're saying there isn't, it doesn't exist, right? Any body, right? Two separate words. So there isn't a body, right? Nie ma żadnego ciała, czy żadnych zwłok. So there isn't a body. Then how do you know there's been a murder, right? So here it's all very hypothetical, right? Right, and we used there is, there has been, and so on. So we are, of course, talking about something for the first time, but also something potential. Okay, so page 2, number 102. the house. The house next door to us is for sale. Right. With numbers like 100, 1,000, a dozen, a million, right? We can use one or we can use a with the same meaning basically. So we use the indefinite article with such numbers. So a number 102, the house next door to us, right? So the specific house next door to us is for sale. It's quite a nice house, right? We've talked about quite a on the previous page. So it's quite a nice house. House is countable, of course, with big rooms, right? So that's what it has. It has big rooms, right? So this is indefinite, but of course the noun is plural, so we cannot use a. So with big rooms, practicing patience. So with big rooms, okay, and that's the end of the sentence actually. So the back windows, right? So again, we have parts of an object. A house has the front windows and the back windows often. The back windows as opposed to the front windows, right? Look out on, and here most likely we would say the park, right? Because if we're talking about our area, our house, right, that we are assuming that, you know, if there's a park, that's the one in the area or next to our house somewhere. Right. Of course, this depends on the context, but in this particular context, it seems reasonable to assume that the other person or people that we're talking to would know about the park if they know about the house, right? Okay, I don't know what price the owners are asking. So what price, right? Obviously with what, like which. So we cannot put an article here, but the owners, meaning the owners of that house, right? The owners are asking. But Dry and Rot are the agents, right? So we are not just saying that they are agents, that it's their job, right? We are saying that they are the agents who are taking care of this sale, basically, right? So they are the agents we should talk to, right? You could give them a ring. So of course, to give somebody a ring means to call somebody on the phone, to phone somebody. So you could give them a ring and make them an offer, right? So just make them an offer, some kind of offer. Okay, the postman's little boy. So obviously we know which postman we're talking about here, right? The postman's little boy, so the postman that brings the post to us. So the postman's little boy says that he'd rather be a dentist than a doctor, right? So obviously before jobs, when we just talk about having a certain job or profession, we use a, right? He's a dentist, she's a doctor. So he'd rather be a dentist than a doctor because dentists in general, right, plural. So no article. Come on. Dentists don't get called out at night. At night, no article, right? At night, by day, at noon, but in the afternoon, in the morning, and so on. Okay, you also hear in the night sometimes, so then you would use the article. Just as, and of course we have this explanation here which makes it much easier. So as the okay, so as the air hostess, right? Assuming there was only one on the plane, or at least the one that serves us. It's just as the air hostess was handing me a cup of coffee, and no article here, right? So a cup of coffee, a cup of tea. I hope that's obvious. The plane, so the plane we were flying on, so you can't say that this is not defined in this context, gave a lurch, and the coffee, I think I may have worked out the problem here. I just need to make this rectangle bigger than the text, probably. So so the coffee went all over the person on the other side of the gangway, right? Yeah, so which person? The person on the other side of the gangway, right? So gangway would be, I guess, another name for the aisle, right? I'm not sure if this word is used nowadays, but there's just one passage, right, between the seats. So the other side of the gangway. Okay, there was a collision. There was a collision between a car, right? So we're just reporting an incident, right? What we saw or heard about. So we know nothing about this. I mean, that's not a specific car or cyclist that we've mentioned or that we know about. It's just a collision between a car, some car, and a cyclist, right? At the crossroads near my house, right? So specific crossroads near my house. Of course, no article before the possessive. Early in the morning, right? I mentioned the morning, the evening, and so on. But here, obviously, the cyclist, right? Because he's been mentioned, or she. The cyclist was taken to hospital, and I talked about that on the previous page, right? He was taken, or she was taken to hospital with concussion, right? So when we talk about like a medical condition, to be taken to hospital with something, right? In most cases, there is no article because these are uncountable nouns, right? Concussion, nausea, vertigo, so all those medical conditions, ailments, except a few that are actually countable, like a cold. But most of those medical terms, they are uncountable. So with concussion, the driver, right? So here, obviously, we are referring to that car that took place in the accident. So the driver of the car, not just any driver. So the driver of the car was treated for shock. And again, it's similar to concussion here. because it's like medical condition, basically. Shock can often be countable, but when we talk about this kind of medical condition in this case, right? Because in these circumstances, it refers to this condition you're in. So for shock, normally we say witnesses say, right? Because we haven't mentioned any witnesses. Of course, you could assume that what you mean is the witnesses to this accident or of this accident, but it's not obvious that there had to be witnesses, right? So it's like saying, okay, there were some witnesses and they say, right? So in most situations you would just say witnesses say, unless you've already specified or implied that there were witnesses. Witnesses say that the car, obviously in this context, was going at 70 miles an hour, right? So obviously no article before this numeral here. And we say 70 miles an hour, 50 kilometers an hour, and so on, right? So so n here means per, right? Per hour. Professor James, the man who discovered the new drug that everyone is talking about, refused to give a press conference, right? So Professor Jones is, so we're saying he's the man, that specific man who discovered the new drug that everyone is talking about. So both the man and the drug are definite, they are defined, right? So he's the man who discovered the drug. Which drug? The drug that everyone is talking about, right? If you said, in this context, if you said a man, this would probably imply that there were more men who discovered the new drug or something like that, but it doesn't make much sense. Okay, Peter Piper, I've missed this one, refused to give a press conference, right? To give a press conference, to give a lecture. Okay, Peter Piper, a student, one of many, in the professor's college, and probably refers to this Professor Jones, the professor's college, asked him why he refused to talk to the press, right? So that's like the government and the police, we say the press, right? We're going to, okay, so here tea refers to, doesn't necessarily refer to the drink, it refers to the meal, right? Where you take some tea, maybe some cake. So we're going to tea, right? So when you talk about meals, you normally don't use the article. So we went to dinner, right? I went out to lunch or for lunch, and so on. I had breakfast, right? So if it's not specified or modified by any adjectives, then normally meals, we don't use an article with meals, right? So we're going to tea with the Smiths today, right? So we're talking about the family, aren't we? Or aren't we? Shall we take the car, right? That's the most likely situation. Shall we take the car? Because we are assuming we have one car, right? Unless we actually have several cars and we are wondering, shall we take one of those cars, right? Shall we take a car? But I suppose in most situations you would either have one car or you would just know that that's the car we would drive there, right? So So shall we take the car? Okay, we can go by car. So remember, you can say take the car, or be in the car, she's in the car, on the bus, on the train, on the bike, but by car, by bike, by train, by bus. So this describes the means of transport, right? So it doesn't mean it doesn't refer to any specific car, bike, or train. It's just an expression, by car. If you wash the car first, right? So again, here we are referring to that specific car that we would use, or that we have. We can't go to Mrs. Smith's, and I think I may have made a mistake while correcting your completed exercises, because I somehow didn't notice that this was Mrs. and I thought that this was the Smiths like earlier, so I may have implied or corrected your entry here by suggesting that this should be but of course there should be nothing here because it's Mrs. Smith. In a car, all covered with mud, right? And so here, of course, we are referring to the same car, right? But we are kind of generalizing and saying that we can't go in this kind of car, right? So in a car all covered with mud. So it's like saying not just in this particular situation, not just this car, any car, right? So it's like saying we shouldn't really use a car which is covered in mud. So it doesn't matter if it's this car or another car. So we are not really saying that it's just this car that can't be covered with mud. It's just any car, right? So we shouldn't travel in such a car, right? So that's what it's what it means basically. Okay, so he got a job in the south. So he got a job, some job, right, in the south. So we always say the south, the north, the east, and so on, and spent the next, so I talked about next, last, and so on, the next 2 years doing. Right, so probably nothing. Doing work he really enjoyed, because that's what this means is the kind of work he really enjoyed, and we don't necessarily know what kind of work this is, right? Or specifically what his hobby or what his preferences are. So a bit hard to explain, but that's what most likely we would say. Doing work he really enjoyed. Like if it was a countable noun, we would probably use a, like working in a job he enjoyed, right? So it doesn't matter what job it was specifically. He worked in that kind of job, in a job that he enjoyed, right? Okay, so let's continue. It's a pleasure. It is a pleasure to do business with such an efficient organization. So it is a pleasure to do business with such an efficient organization, right? So it's a pleasure, it's a joy, and so on. So that's what we say, right? It is a pleasure. It was a pleasure to meet you, right? To do business. So this is a collocation, to do business with somebody. So we don't use any articles. And yeah, so this is basically an expression meaning, you know, meaning to do business, right? So we don't use an article here. With such an efficient organization. So organization is countable. We've got such, right? So such an efficient organization, such a big house, and so on. Day after day, right? So those expressions, so day after day or day by day, night after night, and so on. So we use no article here. It's like a fixed phrase, fixed expression with after or by, day after day, month after month, week after week, and so on. Past without news, right? Past without any news, we could say also, right? So this is indefinite, right? That's not what I wanted. Okay, so so past without news, and we began to lose hope. To lose hope, right? No need for an article. Hope is, of course, an abstract noun, an uncountable noun also. So yeah. Okay, so would you like to hear a story? Right. I hope that doesn't mean that this doesn't need explaining. A story about an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scotsman, right? So 3 people that we're mentioning for the first time. So that I think that should be pretty obvious. Okay, so the next sentence. Now, I've heard stories, meaning some stories, right? So I'm not being very specific. So I've heard some stories about Englishmen, right, in general. So it's like the same kind of context, but here it's the plural, right? Because they are stories about Englishmen in general, not any specific Englishman, but some indefinite Englishmen or Irishmen, Scotsmen. Okay, so before, right? And they are all the same. So I hope this doesn't need explaining. All the same. That's what we say, the same. But mine is not a typical story, right? In my story, the Scotsman, right? So here, obviously, once we know that there were those 3 individuals, right? There was a Scotsman, there was an Englishman, there was an Irishman. So in my story, the Scotsman, right? So that particular individual is generous. The Irishman, so this specific Irishman is logical, and the Englishman is romantic. Oh, if it's a fantastic story, so a fantastic story, I'll listen with pleasure, right? So previously we had a pleasure, right? It is a pleasure to do something, but to do something with pleasure. And you can do the same with some other abstract nouns referring to emotions, feelings, states like joy, satisfaction. Do something with satisfaction. Do something with joy. But it is a joy, or I had a lot of satisfaction. Well, that's not a good example, but yeah, with it is, we would say a, right? It is a pleasure, it is a joy, but with pleasure, with joy. So with pleasure, nothing here. Okay, my aunt lived on the ground floor. On the ground floor, there's just one ground floor in a building, of an old house, mentioned for the first time, because we, of course, we don't have the context, but probably we're mentioning this for the first time, that she lived in that kind of place, the ground floor of an old house on the River Thames. So of course you just have to remember how the articles behave with geographical names, and you can look it up. With rivers we use the article on the River Thames. So of course in this introductory section to the unit on articles, where all the explanations are, you've got all these basic rules for using articles. So she was very much afraid of burglars. In general, she was afraid of burglars, right? Of any burglars that could possibly appear in her life, and always locked up the house, right? Her house, obviously. So it actually does appear, but when I make it smaller, so it's there, but it disappears when it's too small. Okay, so yeah, the house very carefully before she went to bed. Right, so you go to bed, which means go to sleep, right? As opposed to sit on the bed, right? Or to make the bed, or to move the bed. But if you go to bed, or if you are in bed, that means that you're asleep, or you're just, staying in bed, or maybe you're ill, right? So she's in bed with flu. She also took the precaution of looking under the bed, right? So in general, you take a precaution, and if you don't know this phrase or this word, just look it up, of course. But that's a collocation, to take a precaution, right? Or take some precautions. But here you are specifying what kind of precaution you're taking, right? So also took the precaution of looking, right? It's like saying he gave the impression of, right? Right, so it's similar to all those expressions where you have a verb and an abstract noun, like give an impression, give a certain impression, but give the impression of. So she took the precaution of looking under the bed, under her bed, to see if a burglar, right, some unspecified burglar, was hiding there by any chance. So obviously she's not looking for any particular burglar. She just wants to see if there is a burglar. Modern burglars don't hide under beds, said her daughter. So modern burglars in general. Yeah. So they are more sophisticated than to sit under beds. Under beds, right? In general, not under any specific beds, said her daughter. I'll go on looking just the same, said my aunt. So just the same, obviously. One morning she rang her daughter in triumph, right? So again we have an abstract noun, expressing an emotion. So it's like saying in shock, in astonishment, in surprise. So in triumph. I found a burglar, right? So she found a burglar. She found someone, unspecified burglar, under the bed, under my bed, last night, right? So I talked about last, next, and so on. So when we talk about like the last class that we attended, or the next house, right? Of course we use the, but when we talk about time, right? So with those expressions of time like night, week, there's no article, right? Last night, next week. When we say when something happened, when we are not interested in the thing itself, like in the house or the class, this just means this is an expression of time, right? So it answers the question when. Okay, so no article, obviously. She said, and he was quite a young man. So we've had quite a few nouns so far, right? So obviously this is a countable noun. So we have a, the indefinite article. Okay, so this is the exercise, and of course I cannot explain everything in an exercise like this, and explanations themselves aren't enough when we talk about articles or grammar in general. You need the practice, right? Especially with articles, because they can be tricky, and you always have to look at the context, and there are those subtle differences in use. So the more you expose yourself to how they are used, so basically when you listen to something, or even when you're speaking, you should pay attention to how you're using the articles. But in general, of course, practice means doing exercises. So if you can find any exercises on articles, then you're encouraged to do them, as many of them as possible. Yeah, but of course some of you will probably also need to just revise the rules, because it seems some of you are unaware of certain rules, or have forgotten even some basic rules for the use of articles. So those basic rules, like when can we use, which articles can we use in the plural and in the singular, or how do articles behave with abstract nouns like joy or sympathy. And of course there are lots of fixed phrases, fixed expressions, which you just have to know. Generally speaking, of course, fluency comes from practicing, from exposure to the language, from listening, but also paying attention, right? When you're listening to something or reading, you should try to pay attention to how articles are used and why.